Hello, everybody. Can you all hear? Is this okay? Yes? Is it on? Good. Okay, well, I'm very, very happy to be here at Clifton with this amazing quartet. The titles of this panel is Walking the Tightrope, the Dreams and Perils of Female Power. Or as the late great governor of Texas, Ann Richards, said, Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in high heels. So that's why I'm very pleased to have four such amazing women who know all about life on the flying trapeze of power. June Sarpong, my far left, is a broadcaster and presenter who has interviewed everyone worth talking to, now a popular panelist on The Pledge. Her latest book is Diversify, 6 Degrees of Integration, making a powerful case for the moral, social, and economic benefits of inclusion. Priti Patel, there you are, Priti, you've got the third card here, is a daughter of Ugandan Indian immigrants and an MP since 2010. She's also served Secretary of State for International Development, Minister of State for Employment, and Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury. And she's a full-throated voice in favour of Brexit. And I read that she was actually going to a demonstration tonight with Boris Johnson. So I was actually very happy that she showed up at all. So thank you for being here. Cherie Blair, of course, leading barrister, founder of the Cherie Blair Foundation for Women. Is this going off? Yeah. Is it okay now? Is this? Yeah. All right. Cherie Blair, leading barrister and founder of the Cherie Blair Foundation for Women, which does great work training global female entrepreneurs in India, Lebanon, Rwanda, Sierra Leone. She was just in New York last week, doing a lot of that work in the UN week. It just happened in New York. And finally, on my right, Helena Morrison, Dame Helena Morrison, head of personal investing at Legal & General, and one of the most influential women in the city. She's used her clout to pull up as many other women as possible, and she founded a 30% club to get more women on boards. And Helen has amazing news because this week England reached its quota, correct? Brilliant. Okay, big clap. I would actually be remiss if I didn't tell you that she also has 9 children, including 6 daughters, or should I say 6 future board members from Helena Morrison. Right, so I live of course, in the US, and we're just there in a state of simmering rage. Women have erupted into the open, and male leaders are toppling like statues of Saddam Hussein in the wake of Me Too. I mean, they're going down like ninepins. We've had the head of CBS News. We've had, Bill Cosby gone to prison. Harvey Weinstein's trial begins next week. It's just dazzling what's going on. And of course, the editor of the New York Review of Books went down a couple of weeks ago, and then we had the extraordinary spectacle this week of a Supreme Court nominee who had presented himself as an upstanding, church-going scholar and children's basketball coach, being asked if he'd ever ground or rubbed his genitals against his accuser, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. The hearings riveted the nation, of course, and were then followed by an explosion about the shameful treatment by his accuser by Republican senators on the Judicial Committee, which incredibly has not a single female member on their side. It's a gerontocracy right now in the Senate. So I'd like to ask each one of you, really, because it is an extraordinary time. Each one of you, I'd like to ask you, have we reached a watershed moment in the wake of Me Too? What are we to now extrapolate from these extraordinary events that have gone down in the last year? Do you want to start, Cherie?
Sure, of course. I think that what we're seeing is people being prepared to stand up and talk about issues which before they've either been reluctant to or felt afraid to talk about. I think in the melee that's around that, we've also got to hold on to a certain concept of due process. I don't like to see anyone being lynched, whether it's a man or a woman. And so, and in these allegations about sexual behaviour, at the end of the day, you'll always go down to he says, she says, and we have to be really careful, speaking as a human rights lawyer, that we make sure that we act fairly to both sides. I think what I found, and I don't know the rights and wrongs of what happened in that frat thing that they have in America. But what I do I found particularly disturbing was the anger and the kind of, how dare anyone even question that I could possibly have done anything wrong attitude that came out on the male side, not just the pews, but also, as you say, some of the Republican senators, and that aggression and that feeling, how dare you challenge my entitlement, I thought was quite disturbing for somebody who may well end up being on the Supreme Court for 30 years and to be setting the tone and for how society in America is going to be over those next 30 years. So I found that disturbing.
The remarkable thing about that, I think, was if the roles had been reversed. I mean, there was Christine Blasey Ford, super cool, very quiet, very appropriate, and there was the explosive, accusatory sort of sniveling, if I may say, Judge Kavanaugh, which was the exact opposite of what you would expect.
Well,
from
it
a Supreme
goes
Court
back
judge.
to that entitlement. Don't challenge me because this is my right. It's my right to become the Supreme Court judge because I'm immensely qualified for it. And that male sense of entitlement, I think, is often there. It goes to a lot of the time when people say it's political correctness gone mad. What they mean is that now women who are, they kind of accept that women who are exceptional can get through, but the idea that just about okay women should have the same rights as just about okay men is much more difficult because they say, well, actually, that's my position you're taking, because...
Let's ask you, Helena, because you work in the world of finance. I mean, how has Me Too affected your world? And with your 30 Club success, is what Cherie says right, that now we're going to be blessed with having just as many mediocre women on boards as there are mediocre men on boards. There's quite a lot of those.
No, we want some great women, not mediocre ones, and we have plenty of those. So I think the constructive side of Me Too, and here we had the President's Club dinner in this country just in January. I mean, some of these allegations are very historic. And that was this year when there was really awful, salacious stories, but they were true, about terrible harassment at an all-male dinner here. And I think the good news about it, I mean, that dinner was in its 33rd year. And as we've said, women have found their voice, and then change happens quickly. It's not like it's a long, and I don't think things will ever be the same again, in the sense that, in the city now, people are very conscious, not just to be perceived as, being fair, but actually to be behaving correctly as well. And that was certainly not the case when I started 30 years ago in the city. Banter that was totally inappropriate, or would be seen that way now, and worse, was very prevalent. So that's the good news. The bad news, I think, it would be a tragedy if we end up being alienating men from women. 30% Club has succeeded, at least in achieving its somewhat narrow objective of more women on boards, because it's very much involved men. Men who've seen the need for change, not always because they have daughters, but because they think we can make the boardroom or the management team or the company just better, and we can bring other things to the table. And I would hate to see us not being able to move on from, what is a lose-lose situation at the moment, it seems, where everybody's upset, everybody's angry, there's a very divisive tone in the discussion. So you mentioned due process, Cherie, and I was just going to conclude with, I did the review of into when they were the minority partner in the coalition government here, into the Liberal Democrats' situation around how the accusations against Lord Reynard of sexual harassment were aired on Channel 4 News, and I was asked to look into all of the processes and culture. And if my advice to my daughters, based on everything that I've seen then and would see now, was it's really hard to go back later on and to prove anything. And if something bad happens, speak out then and there, you will be heard. And that's the great news. But to fester, to let it come out later when it's so hard to prove you're right, it just causes agony for everybody.
But that's the cultural change, isn't it? That people can feel that they can speak out. And when we're talking about harassment, actually there are young men who are harassed as well, as we know. So it's whether you're a man or a woman, we have to have a culture where people can speak out and be heard.
Priti, Patel, you're someone, of course, who's who's been tremendously prominent in politics. What was it? How did it strike you watching these hearings yesterday, and how did you feel that Me Too has sort of played out in the political arena?
So I just think we're in such a fascinating and interesting time right now, full stop. people have voices and they're leveraging their voices in a way in which I think generations ago they simply wouldn't have, both men and women. And, just in the political sphere, I've been around as a member of my party for 30 years. So I've seen a lot in terms of politics. I worked in the private sector. I've done a stint in the city as well. Culturally, things are changing. But I think in the political world, things have got to move forward really fast, because Cherie's used the term entitlement. Now, I have to say, I think that label absolutely applies to the world of politics. I don't see enough meritocracy in politics, in our politics in this country. I don't see people getting the right jobs because they're fit for the job, they're right for the job, they've got the right skills and experience. There's all the other patronage nonsense that goes on with it. So coming back to the US and Kavanaugh right now, the conduct is highly questionable, of course. That's quite a process I think everybody's going through. But, when you're applying for a really big public job, Supreme Court, where you've got to be objective, where you have to be able to exercise the right kind of judgment, where you need to be impartial. You cannot have this sort of entitlement mentality. You cannot be defensive. You cannot be just defending you yourself and your reputation. You've got to really think about it and have a degree of self-awareness as well as to not just how this is going to land and play, but what this means for your own reputation going into a role like that as well. And I do think in Westminster, we've seen a lot of change over the last few years on harassment. We still hear stories too frequently about staffers in Westminster that are exposed or experiencing sexual harassment, intimidation and bullying. That culture in our politics has to go out of the window, it really does. I've worked at chief exec level, chairman level, at board level of multinational companies. I have to say I've never experienced environments like that. So why should it be acceptable in Westminster? Why should anybody be tolerating that in Westminster? And that is the biggest change that I think we actually need to see.
June.
Yes.
Media.
Yes.
You must see it through a different prism.
Yeah. So
what's your take on it?
My take on it will be, however this Kavanaugh case plays out, it will tell us what we've learned since Anita Hill. And I think in 27 years, we're more or less in the same place. And when the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas case happened, what happened was the year after, many women stood for election and many women decided to actually become politicians because they just could not abide by what they saw happening. And for me, what I find so frightening was the level of double standards that were displayed during that hearing in terms of just how measured and graceful Dr. Blasey Ford had to be, whereas Kavanaugh was allowed to be completely rude and belligerent. And for me, I just thought the partisanship that he displayed disqualified him, period, before we even got to the accusations. So if he gets on the Supreme Court, it shows us we have a very long way to go, but what does excite me is the amount of women that are going to stand, and I tell you what, this will not happen next time round. So that for me is what I'm excited
Well, it will certainly
about.
inflame Me Too tremendously if he does get on. It will truly inflame it. And you could even see a march, I think, like we had when one, after 2016. Well, women are making, as we know, tremendous inroads, but you could argue that the world is still ruled by mad men, right? Putin, Trump, Erdogan, and soon possibly Boris Johnson, for all we know. So, Cherie, do male leaders get greater forgiveness for their transgression?
I couldn't possibly comment on whether Boris Johnson was mad or not. I think he's bad, but whether he's mad or not, I'm not sure.
Moving smartly on. Do male leaders, do you think, get greater forgiveness for their transgressions than women?
I think it's I suppose, I would say that sometimes women are more condemned for their transgressions, and we tend to, men seem to have a much better ability to be rehabilitated. And I think that's partly a function of the fact that there are fewer women. So all of us here at one stage has probably been the first or the only woman in situations. And because of that, you're kind of carrying an additional burden. It's not just about you, is it? It's about what this says about other women, or at least what people think it says about other women. And so if you do fall from grace, therefore the fall has that additional burden as well. It doesn't happen in the same way for men, because people just assume, well, obviously a man can be a chief executive and a man can be a prime minister and a man can be a media mogul or whatever it is, and therefore somehow or other women too put a lot of stress on the women who do succeed, and therefore are often perhaps harsher on them than they are on the men who, we're all human and people do have failings.
Do you ever feel that Theresa May is sort of bullied?
Yes, I do. I'm very sympathetic to Theresa May. I don't think if she, in her position, managing it's a hell of a job. After all, Boris Johnson didn't have the courage of his convictions to actually stand up and make this thing work. He was perfectly happy to sit back and let Theresa May take the fall for him. I mean, I don't regard that as leadership at all. And they sit there and they snipe at her, and and she's got an impossible hand to play. It's very, very difficult. And I do think there's an element of sexism in that. I do.
Priti Patel, obviously you were sacked by Theresa May, right? I mean, so do you ever feel that she is bullied, or do you think that she gets a fair shake?
I do actually have a different perspective on this. I mean, look, you're Prime Minister, for God's sake, okay? You have all the levers at your command in terms of decision-making, huge responsibilities, obviously. Being Prime Minister is not a walk in the park. It is not a tea party. It's one of the toughest jobs in the world. And it's a privilege to do that job. But you have the best advisors, you make your political choices as to who you want in your team as well. And you work with people in your team and you get the best out of people. Yes, you give them the freedom to succeed, but you empower them to support you as well. That to me is leadership. Now, Theresa May has her own style of leadership, absolutely. And I'm not here to run her down at all. Whether or not she's brought or calibrated all the key levers together, I simply don't know. Because, it's been a very messy 12 months for her, absolutely. In terms of, my own experience, it was a privilege for me to be in government. I'm very open about that. I was very loyal to Theresa. I'd be loyal to any leader that I'm serving. I just don't think she got the best out of the people that she had around her, basically, working with her. And I know
they weren't really working with her.
No,
to be fair.
Maybe not everyone.
There were plenty of those men who were just dying to take her job.
Okay, so there you go, exactly.
To be fair, you were supporting her. But, there were plenty of others.
So in the minority, of course, exactly. So there's an irony to this, isn't there? Because I do think it's some of the loyal, diligent people that, then end up carrying the can for those that don't actually behave as a team, support her and all the rest of it. I tell you now, I've sat in cabinet meetings where, the meeting would start off saying, well, people mustn't leak, people mustn't brief. My response would be, well, it's not all of us here. Go and have it out with the person that's responsible or the 2 or 3 people that are responsible. So, I do think, coming back to your original point as well, I think it's tougher for women. Doesn't mean we have integrity, obviously. I think we're slightly more self-aware than some of the blokes, quite frankly. I think the men do behave really badly. They push the boundaries, they push the envelope. And I think there's a lot that needs to change. But the way to change that is not just by calling them out, but actually for some of us women to absolutely just step up and work. We do have to work even harder in politics. I will say that. I found that in every walk of life and sphere that I've worked in. I do think we work much more harder than the boys that come in with the entitlement. They get their fat job title. They think I'm nice and cushy here. I'm here to stay. We are the ones always proving ourselves, and we'll always go the extra mile to show, I can do the job and I can do it really well.
Right. Can I just ask June, because have you shared that experience? Do you agree with Priti that, in a sense, you have to be a gold performer in a silver job if you're a woman?
100%. And I just want to go back to your original point and also touch on what Cherie said. I think Theresa May actually displayed a terrible case of internalized misogyny. Priti and I were on the opposite side of the Brexit debate, but I came out in defence of her when Theresa May fired her, because for me, it was unbelievable, the double standards. Boris Johnson was in trouble at the same time. He was not fired. Then later on, you had the case between Justine Greening and Jeremy Hunt. Justine Greening was let go. Jeremy Hunt, who was supposed to be fired, was given a promotion. And I think sometimes women, we actually can be our own worst enemy. And for somebody like Theresa May in that position to treat the women who were loyal to her from the beginning in her cabinet so badly is a disgrace. I think it's an absolute disgrace.
Wow, that's very interesting to hear. Helena, I mean, you could argue, of course, that Theresa May was the classic glass cliff appointment, right? I mean,
given a
she
really
only got the job
challenge,
because a big bunch of, hooray Henrys, had completely sort of bollocksed it all up. And so, so there she was. And she didn't even, she'd never run for anything, actually, really, except for her own seat.
Well, she wanted that job, clearly.
She wanted the job. So do you think that she's a classic, she's been put in the classic position? And why do women get these jobs only, it seems, when things have been bollocksed up?
So, well, maybe in theory, because we could be very capable and able to resolve things. I would love to see, one thing that I don't think has really happened yet, and in business or politics, has been women feeling enough confidence to actually lead like a woman. I mean, that maybe sounds a bit trite, but I think we've tended to, certainly when I started, and I know, Cherie, I've heard you speak before and you talked about your early career, we had to lean into very masculine approaches. We had to be very confrontational. We had to be more macho than the men, and I think that's completely unnecessary, and actually we could contribute so much more to how things are resolved now if we have the confidence to be ourselves. I think there's a genuine realization, and this was what happened with the women on boards here, that actually the boards would be better if you had more women, but not more women pretending to be men, but women actually bringing their own ideas to the table, their own ways of working, collaborating, being compassionate, being more empathetic. We're badly missing that, particularly from politics, I'd say, where again, this divisive point. And so it's okay to have the confidence to take the position, but then she needed to have the confidence to actually be herself and not perhaps to take advice, to have a vision, to build her own sense of what it was to be a leader. And I don't think we've seen that in women leaders.
No, but there's some research that shows that what they call the sort of honest overconfidence, that men consistently believe that they're better than they are. Literally, they're not being dishonest in any way. They really believe it. And the opposite is true. Women consistently believe they're worse than they are.
But we've heard this again and again about the old imposter syndrome. I mean, I was struck the other day when I read a quote from Emma Walmsley, who's of course the CEO of GlaxoSmithKline. So she's a huge big deal. I mean, she's probably the biggest CEO in the UK. And she said that even though she's the first female head of a global drug maker, she said, "I'm starting to be convinced I have a right to be at the top table in business." And I just felt sad,
but
honestly.
that's to do with the culture. It's to do with the culture, which for years and years and years has been driven by men who have basically relied on everything else in their life being dealt with by somebody else, mainly their wives, but could be somebody else. And then all they have to do is succeed in their jobs. And the culture has been built around them. And then as a woman comes in and, wanting to be true to her nature, which is also to want to have a family as well, and all those things, it's much more difficult to go there. And there's nothing in the system, or we have to change the system to acknowledge the fact that we have to make it accessible for people and parents, and not just entitled men.
We've heard a lot about the pay equity issue, obviously, in the last year. Carrie Gracie waged her amazing, I mean, it really was an incredible thing she did, I think, for women at the BBC, when she just really went for it and refused, to have anything except exact sort of parity, as opposed to just a raise for doing the same job as a bureau chief. But she had to make a lot of noise, in a sense. I mean, how much do you think this whole question of, women don't know enough about how to ask for things and don't have this critical issue of confidence, which comes up, obviously, in the Helena, in the Emma Klein quote. Do you see this again and again in business, or are women getting past that now?
Well, I think with interventions, they get past it. And I do believe, I know there's always a debate about mentoring and sponsorship. I just think if people have allies and we make sure that women aren't just left adrift by themselves to try and build this confidence that they might not have to start with, often the very subtle differences between men and women who are coming up in their careers, and then suddenly the woman falls behind, not necessarily because they've had children. Actually, they perhaps haven't put themselves forward, and they get passed over for promotion or not given the pay rise. It doesn't take a huge amount to sit down with that person, but they have to be someone has to look out for them, and then hopefully by the time we've effected change, then instead of needing to ask for a pay rise, we'll have companies that actually recognise better people and will pay them more. I don't agree with the idea, which I know, infamous interview with Kathy Newman and Jordan Peterson, where he was saying, well, one of the reasons, I mean, it's the truth, one of the reasons women are paid on average less is because we're more agreeable. And more agreeable people tend to get paid less because we are not standing up for ourselves. But it would be such a tragedy if we were encouraged to be less agreeable. His definition of agreeable is compassionate and polite. We need, I keep saying the same thing, compassion and politeness in our organisation. So we have to work out, you use the expression, change the system. I do think the answer lies in the next generation. I see young men in particular coming forward, including in my own company. A young man who must be now 27 approached me soon after I joined about a year ago and said he wanted to get involved in the gender equality work. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, I look at the 50-year-old men around me and I love my job, but I don't want to work like them. And I think I can do a great career without that. And it doesn't seem necessary with technology. And also I have a girlfriend, we're thinking of settling down, having children. We both want to have careers. We both want to play a role in our families' lives. He's not an isolated case. And somehow we have to kind of
phone number
bring
from my
them
daughter.
in. Well, I'm thinking of cloning him, actually. I mean, like if we could just work out how to clone him.
Right. This is definitely true. I look at my own son. I've now got 2 grandchildren, and he genuinely, I mean, his father was pretty good, to be fair, compared to the rest of them anyway, I can tell you. He was told once in the 80s by the Northern Whip, the Labour Party, Tony, if you stop, you've got to stop going home at 7 o'clock after the vote and coming back at 10 to go and see your children. He said, you've got to stay in the bars, otherwise you'll never get anywhere in politics. And that was the culture at the time.
Is that what you're going to say?
So look, I mean, I've got so much that I can say on all of this. So I really
Go.
So when I was elected in 2010, I just had a baby. My son was actually under 2 years old, and he was a sick child. He was in hospital quite a lot. I had a stand-up row, and I go public about this because I thought he was appalling, with our chief whip at the time, Sir George Young, who didn't even understand the concept of childcare. And I don't live in Westminster. I'm not a privileged type. I go home to my family every night. And so, you know what? I thought, I'm going to have it out with you because, you know what? I'm not going to hang around. You need to treat me like a professional person. Doesn't matter my gender, but I'm sure you're talking down to me because I'm a woman and you're trying to belittle me. And you know what? You have to stand up and we have to call this out. And we actually have to demonstrate that, yeah, we're professional. We have confidence to go out there and make the case and obviously get on with it. There is something fundamental, though, I think, to this discussion that no matter what sector we've all worked in, we haven't actually spoken about meritocracy. And I still think, from my own personal professional experience, we don't get through enough on merit. And I think, Helena, in the city still, it's too much based on who you know. Yeah. And I think that cuts across so much of our lives. Yeah. It really does. That's part of what we have to crack here with women, girls, education, but actually giving them the confidence to succeed as well as that freedom to succeed and to go forward and not just ask for the pay rise, but demonstrate that, we are equal, or I would argue in some cases even better than, the so-and-so over there, basically.
So what do you think has been a bigger barrier or bigger challenge, should I say? Because it's not a barrier. What's a bigger challenge to you in your career, gender or class?
So I still think class is still there. I mean, I absolutely think it's there. Totally. I really do. Look, I'm a Conservative Member of Parliament, okay? So people would just sort of say, oh, you don't worry about that kind of stuff, do you? But, don't call me a toff, for God's sake. I came from a very, very hard background. I'm proud of my roots and origins. I'm amazingly proud of my mum and dad, actually, who came to this country with absolutely nothing and have had, worked incredibly hard for myself, my brother and sister, and gave us the opportunities that have put us where we are today in life. I think class across the United Kingdom, British society, still is there, and I still think it's institutionalised. I still think, as I've said, it's about who you know, not what you know. Yep. And that is still a massive barrier to progression, promotion, certainly in politics as well. You know, people like me, God, she's challenging, she stands up for herself, she speaks out, she's got views, don't you know? You know, there's too much of that resistance because they'd rather have people that can tick nice boxes, go with the flow, do the status quo, and, you know, well, that's fine, so-and-so will be okay in that job, and, you know, they just like bypass real meritocracy, and they're just sort of there sitting and blocking other people from coming through.
June, I mean, I could ask the same question to you in a different way, but what has been more of a barrier or challenge to you, gender or race?
Yeah, well, and class too. I think that's why we all need to understand intersectionality, in the sense that there's a hierarchy of inclusion in society. And I think it's really important to know where you are on that ladder so that you know who you need to help bring up, but also to understand your own privilege. So the experience of a privileged white woman is very different to the experience of a working class black woman. And I think often when it comes to the gender debate, we don't actually differentiate enough, and we don't understand intersectionality enough. And I think it's important that we take a sort of bird's eye view and we deal with it obviously as a collective, but we also need to understand those nuances because that's the only way we create long-term sustainable change.
I think so. In the law, for example, I don't think it's going to work if all we end up doing is replacing the posh boys with posh girls.
Women, precisely.
Exactly.
Got to be every
It's not really good. It's not really good. That's not really what it's all about. But the truth is, of course, certainly in my profession now, and I'm sure in the city and other things, if you don't have money behind you to be able to do the internships, to be able to support yourself through the early days, how are you ever even going to start?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's that's one of the real problems.
That ladder of opportunity.
Yeah.
How can we support people get there?
Given that we keep hearing, of course, in all of this that this confidence to come forward is such an important thing, which women often feel they don't have. I guess I would like to ask all four of you, actually, where did you all get your amazing confidence, right? Because all four of you have succeeded in different sectors. You've obviously overcome enormous challenges. I'd love to know...
Well, my husband says it's because I'm a Bolshie Scouser.
Where did that come from?
Well, it's funny, there must be something in the water, because if you actually look at the Northwest, it has produced, certainly in my profession, more female judges than any other region. It's produced some incredible, the northern women, Bolshie politicians, strong women. But otherwise, I got it because... Otherwise, I got it from my mum and my grandmother, who was so determined that I was going to have those opportunities and succeed. As I'm sure your parents were too, that the opportunities they didn't have. They made so many sacrifices to enable me to be able to use the talents that I had.
Helena, obviously you've really set yourself on this crusade to bring women onto boards and raise them up. And what drove you to want to do that so powerfully?
Well, I certainly didn't want to see what happened to me in my early career when I did have some discrimination because of my gender, particularly when I'd had my first child. The idea of anyone going through that again was just, motivation enough. But I didn't, until there was a financial crisis, I didn't think that, well, I knew because the actions I was taking weren't really creating results, that actually there wasn't the same moment or motivation on the other side. People weren't listening. There was still, we hardly made any progress really in the first 20 years of my career. Then we had the financial crisis a decade ago, and then it became unequivocal and a deafening wake-up call that actually having one type of person running things, particularly on boards, could not possibly be the right answer. So it came about results. And so suddenly there was this moment to seize, and the members of the 30% Club are chairmen, and obviously mostly men still, and it was all about women and men working together, which is why I'm so keen that we retain that through our next phase. But of course, there were lots of setbacks for me during that. It wasn't by any stretch of imagination a welcome initiative at the beginning. I had lots of hostility. I had hate mail. It was extraordinary, really, because one man accused me of trying to ruin British business, which, even if I ever wanted to, I'm not sure that having a few more women on the board would have really done that. But anyway, but now, of course, I'm so excited about the fact that change is possible. That for the first 20 years of my career, we went from, actually, they didn't even measure the number of women on boards, but by the time they did, it was like 6%. And it went up to 12% when the 30% Club started. And now, of course, we've seen almost a trebling of that. And And it does give me confidence, and you know, I do believe that we need to remember that as the penny drops, as people see this is actually going to create better organisations, if we can get meritocracy to mean more than just do you know everybody, then you can create real change, because people are seeing of it in their own interests. It's not about political correctness, it's not about letting one woman in the door or one black person or one LGBT person. It's about actually having better business.
Priti, I mean, you know, politics is much more of a sort of lone wolf activity, really. I mean, you know, you're not part of a corporation. You don't have sort of mentoring schemes or whatever. I mean, who helped you on the way up? I mean, who did you turn to for advice?
I speak about this quite often, actually. I mean, my family, very small, not political at all, you know, not engaged in public life or politics. And I'm the eldest of three. My father was the eldest of four. And in our culture, you know, the eldest, you know, if stuff happens, you kind of like pick up the pieces, basically. And that's what happened to my dad when his parents were expelled from Uganda. So in terms of, you know, help and motivation, my folks have been absolutely behind me. And I've seen what a hard life they've lived. And I think that just sort of motivates you full stop. I think on top of that, though, I mean, look, I mean, I grew up to be politically aware. Because my parents, I grew up in you know, my family, my aunts and uncles always had more than 2 passports because they were so insecure about the country that they lived in, that they could be moving around the world, all this kind of stuff. My father always taught me just to be politically aware of the country we live in, the type of values of our country. And I just happened to meet my Member of Parliament at the time was a chap called Cecil Parkinson, who was in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. He obviously resigned. He had a lot of stuff going on. Cecil was a remarkable man, actually, a remarkable Member of Parliament. He introduced me to Margaret Thatcher. So I was privileged to get to meet Margaret. And she, you know, I never wanted to be a Member of Parliament, by the way. I've never sort of been one of those, I want to be a Member of Parliament. I've always wanted to follow, you know, what my own instincts, motivations, you know, be educated to the best level that I could be educated, or that, you know, when my family could support me in my education. And I actually just fell into politics. And I spent a lot of time helping people in the community, just being politically not active in terms of demonstrations or things of that nature, but being there in the community, helping, motivating, just supporting people. And that's how I, you know, became political. The rest of it in terms of the hand up, I mean, you know, there's no hand up really, ironically, no ladder of opportunity. The Tories speak about this, but there actually isn't one in the Tory party. It's certainly not through my experience. You just have to prove yourself. And I went out there and, you know, with the grassroots, with associations, and gradually got to become a Member of Parliament, candidate and then elected. It was tough. My mission, I have to say this, and I say this to many, particularly from the Indian diaspora community, who look at me and say, you know, want to be like you, want to be a Member of Parliament. You know, I don't sugarcoat the story at all. There's nothing that's sort of like really glamorous and it all came together like this, that and the other. Work hard, absolutely, but my motivation is absolutely now to make sure there's a ladder of opportunity for others to come forward. I'm not going to be here forever as a Conservative Member of Parliament, and I want to see others from different communities and different backgrounds come through and say, you can do it, and it's a really worthwhile thing to do. You know, serve your country, serve your community, be empowered and make a difference to people's lives. Those were the things that motivated me.
June, who were the big sort of guiding lights for you in terms of thinking you could break out and become, you know, a very prominent broadcaster?
Well, it's fun. Does everybody know what a tiger mum is here?
Yeah.
So the only thing scarier than a tiger mum is a Ghana mum. And my family are Ghanaian. And Ghanaian culture is a matriarchal society. And so the women are emancipated, strong women. And so I was raised by strong women. My great-grandmother was fantastic, as was my grandmother, and my mother is a real character. So I was raised in a household where women were allowed to have opinions and were expected to have opinions. And so I think it really helped coming from that background. And then throughout my career, I've been so lucky. I've just had some fantastic mentors and sponsors and people who were invested in my success, and people that I can just call up from time to time for some advice. In fact,
how many of those were women?
Well, one of them is here, Baroness Rebuck, who's always been so kind to me, you know, from the beginning of my career. And I think just having those people around who want you to succeed really helps. It really does.
Well, Helen, I'm very interested now in the work you've been doing about really reaching out to men, right? Because you have conducted an interesting study called Equal Lives that explored the experiences of fathers and male carers. I'd love to hear what some of your findings have been.
So this is through part of the Prince of Wales Responsible Business Network, Business in the Community, and we had done a project about 5 years ago listening to women in the workplace called Project 2840 and heard some of their experiences and barriers and enablers. And so realizing that inevitably we've been focusing on the women's side of the gender equality, but actually there are two sides to that equation. We asked men what their experience had been, and these were particularly we focused on men who have careers but also have either children or an elderly relative that they wanted to play a part in their lives. And over 10,000 men actually completed this survey, and then we conducted focus groups and interviews and so forth. And the findings were that so many men, they felt there was no barriers in theory to playing a bigger role, but in practice, they felt that it was down to behaviours and attitudes. So that in many cases, particularly men who had, say, an elderly parent or a sick relative that they wanted to play a part in, they hid it from their employers. They didn't say that's what they were doing. And in fact, although women are still 8 times more likely, as we found out through this, to be playing the sort of lead parent role in terms of caring than men, it's only 1.5 times as likely with women than men when it comes to an elderly relative, because often you look after your own parents, obviously. So it's a huge strain on men. And the other finding that was particularly interesting was that same-sex couples, fathers who were perhaps sharing, they obviously bring up children, they said actually they had already broken the social norms, so they just chose what worked for them as a couple. And it made me think, going back to our confidence point, we women, and men as in heterosexual couples should be more deciding, as me and my husband have done really, long time ago. He became a stay-at-home dad, and that's really the secret behind all this kind of 9 children, really. I should give him the credit here and now. But
I certainly do give him the credit.
Yes, he deserves it many times over. But we just decided who was better at what and who wanted to do what. But I now realise, and that was, he's doing that for now 2 decades. Very unusual conversation to have, and we need to kind of get to that point. I think one of the reasons why women's progression perhaps has stalled, if we look at sort of women in senior leadership roles in politics and so forth, it's quite slow progress still, is we've got to think about what it means for men and how can we enable more men to share in some of the things that are otherwise impediments for women's career. We shouldn't be just trying to be super women. We should be encouraging men to be supermen too.
Totally,
yeah.
I totally
Cherie,
agree with that.
do you think that so much of gender inequity just really does boil down to this whole caring issue, the whole absence? Of course, there are so many women now who are single mothers too, so they don't have, in a sense, the luxury even of bringing a man into the process. But do you feel that is the critical issue still?
Well, I was glad Helena mentioned the caring issue for elderly parents and people who are sick, because sometimes we talk about this debate as if it's only about young children.
Yeah.
And it really isn't just about young children. It's about the obligations that we all have as people to each other and to the people who are nearest and dearest to us. And that definitely has an impact on both men and women, actually. And it's because, as I said before, the structures that were set up in business were reflecting a world when it was assumed and that men could sort of subcontract out all the caring responsibilities to their stay-at-home wife. Now, not even sure that was ever 100% true anyway. There were my mother was a single parent for sure, and there was no one to subcontract the earning capacity to. She had to go out and earn as well. But that is definitely not the case today. And with the strains on society and the lack of community ties that we have, and the demands that people have that tend to lead to a necessity. Most people have 2 parents who are working nowadays, 2 daughters or 2, and we have to start thinking, how do we organise work in a way that recognises the reality of people's lives, where they are today, and actually also where they want to be. And that's why discussions like this are important. But if these discussions don't actually lead to changes in workplace practices, then we're just going to be endlessly discussing it. So it's about, yes, having the discussions, but then actually devising practical policies, both at the government level, but also at the company level, and, as you say, into the home, so that people can do what works for them. Because my choices may not be the same
Priti,
as your choices.
But
that doesn't mean we shouldn't all have a choice.
Would your husband give up his job? He's a successful marketing consultant.
Yeah, my husband would, to be fair. My husband would. And, you know, I say to people as well, I can only do the job that I do because of my husband. You know, he's been incredibly tolerant and supportive. You know, he still picks me up from the train station every night, all this kind of stuff. Wow. I don't think most husbands would do that. We have had many crises with childcare and things of that nature. But, you know, we're not the exception. Every other household has that. And I look at this discussion very much from the perspective that, you know, I've been an employer before. I've worked in the private sector. Looking at the world of work and how do we want to get the best out of our people? How do we want to retain talent? How do we want to recruit the best people as well? And what do we need to do to keep them? And so, you know, I think, you know, if I were a big employer right now, gosh, you know, you're running a business, you'd have all sorts of schemes, but also good working practices that would support, you know, an individual that's part of the sandwich generation, children plus elderly parents. There are many of us in that position as well.
Well, technology helps.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
There's so much.
But there's a tyranny of technology, remember.
Speaking of which,
technology enables us to work all the time. Yeah. But it also means that sometimes we never switch off at all. But nevertheless, it makes it easier.
Publicly said that you've frozen your eggs.
I did,
right.
yeah.
So
they're in the fridge.
They're in the fridge.
That won't work, darling.
So, I mean, do you think that the advancement of women in the end is simply about, you know, biology? You know, all of these issues that we're talking about. Is that for you the critical factor?
I think it definitely plays a role in that we need science to completely catch up to women's lives today. And also, but while we're waiting for that, we also do need to have honest conversations with our daughters, in the sense that if you do want biological children and you also want to have a career, it is about making sure that you are aware of all of your choices, which is why I'm thrilled that reproductive rights and education around reproduction is now part of our curriculum. Because I think it's really important. You know, my generation, I'm Generation X, and I think we're the generation who perhaps sold a bit of a lie that you could do everything at the same time. And so what we did was we just focused perhaps more on career than that side of things. And I think it's definitely changing with the millennials and Gen Z, for sure.
It's interesting, in the United States, I met last week with Indra Nooyi, who's just stepped down as CEO of Pepsi, and she strongly believes in what she calls the Asian model of having, you know, generations living together.
And the African model.
And the African model too.
Totally,
and she, to the point that she's actually thinking about how to build communities going forward,
it
which
works.
will have.
The only problem with that, actually, you know, is I've got 9 children. Just think how many grandchildren.
Well, Helen, actually,
I mean, the generation next.
I was actually going to say the only solution. I was
only 1 grandchildren.
No, the best thing that June can do is actually maybe adopt some of your children.
Yeah, happily. And I've met your kids. They're great. Happy to.
Really interesting from the Asian culture and probably the African culture as well. We should also be very mindful of, these are some of the fastest growing economies in the world.
They are.
India has, you know, one of the largest growing middle classes in the world. And you know what? They're all travelling. They want to live and work abroad right now. And they're having their children overseas. So they haven't got their mums and dads and grandmas and granddads to do that network anymore.
That's got to change. We could go on and on. Actually, I wanted to ask you one quick lightning round, but I think we've actually gone out of time because we now need to turn to the audience and ask anybody here if they have a question. Can I have the pink sweater sitting here on the 3rd row?
There was a study done in Australia recently that actually found that women in Generation X and Y in the legal and business professions do ask for pay rises and other raises as much as the men of those generations, but get rejected more. I don't know if the same is true over here, but assuming it is, what advice do you have for the women of those generations?
Well, one thing I would say is a good thing, actually, is that now we're having the gender pay
reporting.
Data. So we've got actually now starting to get data.
Yeah.
And if you have data, then you can measure things, and it can raise. You know, people can say, everything's fine in our workforce. Then you actually look and you discover, lo and behold, well, actually, maybe basic pay is the same, but look at the bonuses and you know, sometimes just transparency around these things forces people to think, because all of us make assumptions, all of us have unconscious bias. The question is recognizing it and trying to do something about it. So I keep talking about systems and things, but these systems help.
But then again, it still took Carrie Gracie to make that noise when the transparency...
Well, yeah, but we'd already, to be fair, the legislation was already on the statute.
Reporting was why she knew.
And
that was a catalyst
reporting
for
is
it.
why she knew.
No, I'd agree entirely. The data. Ask for the data. Say, and we've got to talk more about money in this country, because women haven't historically had, you know, it's not just pay that's equal, but you know, we have gender, we don't invest as much, it's harder for us to get funding for new businesses. The women in this country, when they get to the 65 at present, have a pension pot 1/5 of the size of men's on average. Not 1/5 less than, but 1/5 of, which is horrific. And so this whole financial, I mean, we are waking up now to the need to control our destiny better, have more choices, have less hardship. So ask for the data. Companies these days, going back to the initial remarks about speak up, it's very hard for them to say, well, you can't have the data. I mean,
I'd like to see the data is your new catchphrase. I would like to see the data.
There's transparency around that data.
It's on a motive, it's showing you know how to speak the language of business. You just say, I just like the data.
And I'd just like to add to that, sometimes it's better to also ask as a collective. So, you know, partner with women that are at the same level as yourself in the company and go as a group to ask. It's very hard to say no to a lot of people versus one. And then you're not seen as the troublemaker.
Maybe some men might join as well.
And the men
That would
too.
be good.
Yeah.
Probably will.
Okay. Can we sit? Is this a man raising his hand on just behind? No, you. Okay, sorry. Yes, lady with the scarf.
So you mentioned at the very beginning, it feels very much as though we're at a watershed moment, and you kind of mentioned toppling statues and these sorts of things. So my question to you is, each of you, what does success actually look like? Where do you see us in 50 years? Because I think what we have seen is, you know, the toppling of statues is the easy part. It's what comes after that's much more difficult to achieve. So I'm curious what that looks like for each of you.
Well, I'd like a complete shake-up of society so that it's, you know, I don't think it's a swapping of men and women's roles, but with the longer working lives that we're likely to have, multiple careers, part-time work sometimes, using technology and so forth, I think we've got to change the way we work and change the way we bring out families so that it's much more of a shared, much less assumed that, you know, women do one thing and men do another. And that, for me, is, you know, it's real gender equality. It's not just that women can progress, but that also men have more choices too. I think men are very straitjacketed as well.
I think you're right, and I think part-time working is part of this, you know, and flexible working. You shouldn't always assume that you can, in your life, you can always work, you know, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I mean, in fact, it's very, very bad for you anyway. What sort of person are you if that's all you've got in your life? But nevertheless, there will be times in your life, particularly if you're a woman and you're going to go through childbirth. You know, you can't give birth as they expect you to do in America, you know, today and go back to work. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's just not physically possible. Yeah. And so, but that doesn't mean that you have to give up work entirely either. So it's a question of balancing that. And maybe sometimes you may want to emphasize more family than you do work. But, you know, the point is then that there's opportunities for you to change your balance at a different stage in your life. And I agree with you about the fact that we're living longer. This means that and we're healthier for longer. This means there's more opportunities for people also to, you know, start a new career, do something different in your 50s, in your 60s. Value people in their 70s and 80s for what they can contribute.
Yes.
You know, this is about valuing everybody, giving everybody the chances and the choices that they need, and not writing people off because they're a woman, or writing them off because they're too old, or writing them off because they're too young or too black, or we could go on.
You want to answer what success looks
I
like?
I completely agree with the comments that have been made. I think we've got to be radical. You know, what's the point of even talking about this if we're just going to perpetuate the status quo? We have to continuously, yes, be advocates, but at the same time look at the changing nature of the world of work. Absolutely, as we've heard already. But this is about people, future generations, how we nurture them to actually value, you know, some of the great opportunities that they will have in life, but also to really put them in command, in control of their own futures, in a way in which I don't think we're there at all right now. We feel like, you know, we've got a career going on here. This is what the norms around a legal career will be, you know, 24/7 working, Cherie, you know, working exactly, you know, but doing the international, doing the time zones as well. Same, I worked in consultancy. You know, you therefore conform. You meet a certain stereotype and certain expectation. I think actually we've got to teach a whole new generation that actually you don't have to conform to stereotypes. You're not all about meeting those expectations. You can be good and better and outstanding by, yes, driving great outcomes, but working very differently. And that means that world of work has to change. We have to have greater flexibility, but we have to have a better understanding actually about what it is we value in our society.
June?
I think it's when we get to a place where everybody in society has the opportunity to contribute to the best of their ability. And I think the only way we get there is by, as individuals, looking at our own limiting beliefs and therefore putting pressure on the companies that we work for in terms of their policies, but also pressure on our policymakers to make sure that legislation is fair and equal. And that's all you can ever want, you know. And I think the wonderful thing about inequality, if there is anything good about inequality, is we know what works. We know what works in that we see what happens to privileged white men in our society because of how the system is set up for them to succeed. If we're able to do the same for everybody else, I think that's when we get to a place of success, because you're being given the opportunity to be the best that you can be in society. So
yeah, but the disadvantage with that, of course, is that those some of those privileged white men are going to just not be as successful as they think they're entitled to. And that, you know, and dealing with the backlash.
With the backlash of that, but that's why everybody has to be involved.
One of the things we have to, you know, getting everyone involved is one thing, but if my privilege is being taken away from me, I'm probably, you know, wanting to fight to hell to make sure I keep hold of it.
As Gloria Steinem said, nobody gave up power without a fight.
No, exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Over here in the white sweater.
Hi. So we've talked a lot about women who have power and women who are in power. What about those women for whom gender and class intersects a bit more and who are in a position where they're actually maybe in a 0-hour contract or shouldering the burden of childcare and employment? Yeah. How do we make sure that the people that we are describing as mediocre or average, how do you make sure that those people are empowered as well?
No, absolutely. That's why I said, you know, it's all very well to have a Margaret Thatcher becoming the first woman prime minister, but you know we can list a whole load of people. Well, possibly a lot of people. There's lots of prime ministers people don't remember, and that's because they weren't actually. I mean, mediocre is probably unfair, but you know they weren't necessarily stellar. But unless there's opportunities, equal opportunities, then you don't get a level playing field. And you're also right, because when we talk about what we're doing, and you know, how did I manage? Well, obviously I managed with help from my family, but also, of course, I employed a nanny. You know, what would I have done without her work? What would I have done without my cleaner's work? You know, and they were people, they were, you know, we have to be careful that we don't just trample on someone else in order to succeed ourselves. It's a very delicate, interconnected, all moving parts issue. So you're absolutely right. It's all very well talking about women on boards, and to be fair, you don't just talk about that. But, you know, if all we get is privileged women on the boards, but we're still having... Look at the women in America at the moment at McDonald's, you know, who are standing there and saying, look, we work in this industry, and day after day after day we're suffering from sexual harassment.
Absolutely. Well, that's one of the things about the Me Too movement. At least, exactly. You know, that the privileged women that you keep hearing from, they're the ones who are making the noise, but... You know, it's the woman in the fire service or the woman who's in the waitress that has the most to bear here. Anyone else? We have 1 minute 53. We've probably got room for 2 quick questions.
Okay, let's go.
Lady at the back.
He's put a hand up every time.
Oh, which one?
Towards the back with the blue shirt there. Yeah, there you go.
Good.
Yeah.
I have a question about a young couple in 2 high-flying jobs. They've had a baby, and she's taken maternity leave for 6 months. He's taken paternity leave for the next 6 months, and they're both going back 4 days a week, 2 at home and 2 at the office. Is this the way of the future? Does anyone else here have familiarity with that kind of situation? I found it astonishing. Is this what we're going to expect of major jobs, any jobs?
Sounds great to me.
Who's this
I think they're employers. They should be applauded.
What success looks
I think
like.
people here have no idea. In America, I just learned just the other day that New York City, the City Hall, only 2 years ago gave any maternity leave at all.
Yeah.
That actually people had to patch together their vacation time to get a couple of
or
weeks.
sick leave.
Which is astounding.
But the point you make is a very good one, I think, and it just illustrates what we've been talking about, that you have to change the way work is organised. It shouldn't be so.
I think as well, eventually, if we succeed
remarkable.
in this, we'll look back and we'll think, wasn't it odd the way we did do this sort of 24/7 and had it all. I mean, in lots of ways, what we're trying to do is create what is generally much more normal, rather than have sort of one half of humanity sort of in charge of the other, or have some people sort of selling their hours, their time, their precious commodity of time, because that's what one person in the family has to do, and the other person at home all the time.
But the mummy track is the other thing as well, isn't it? Because what we're seeing, I think, is that at one time just giving women maternity leave can lead, as we've seen, it has led to people somehow or other managing to avoid to employ women. Whereas if you actually have shared parental leave, then you don't no longer see a girl coming for a job and saying, oh, problem in the making because she may have a baby, and then seeing a boy coming for a job and thinking, oh, well, that's fine because he'll be here all the time. But rather you see potential parents coming along where the business will have to manage the fact that at some point they will want to put their family time first.
All right, well, I think unfortunately we've run out of time, because this obviously could go on for another
Can I make a
hour.
request, though?
You may indeed.
Next year, if you have this panel at this event, you have a man on it.
Yeah.
Well, I think 2 men on it, otherwise they're going to feel very cowed. I did this conversation recently with just one man, and he went home feeling just like... So thank you all very, very much for coming.